The storm had come crawling in long before the sun ever slipped away, devouring the horizon in a blinding swirl of white. Music. It was the kind of storm old-timers spoke of in hushed tones, the kind that only showed its face once in a lifetime, when winter chose to bare its teeth and remind every soul out here who truly ruled the land. The wind tore across the open plains like something wounded and enraged, whipping the last stubborn patches of brush that dared rise above the frozen earth. Snow came down hard. Music, sharp as broken glass, cutting into anything left exposed. Even the red howlers had gone to ground. Music. The world had lost all color, reduced to endless white and the faint gray silhouettes of hills drifting in and out like tired ghosts with nothing left to haunt. Between the howls of the storm, the silence stretched so deep it felt alive, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Any man with sense would have stayed behind locked doors and barred windows. No one had any business being out there. And yet, 3 figures pushed forward through the blizzard, leaning into the wind like they were fighting off an unseen force trying to drag them back. From afar, they looked like fading shadows. Music, refusing to disappear. Up close, they were Sihara and her 2 daughters, Apache women who had endured trials far crueler than winter's bite. Sihara, wrapped in a worn wool blanket long stripped of its warmth, pressed onward with a strength carved from years of surviving the unforgiving frontier. Her braids were stiff with ice. The cold had cracked her skin raw, but her eyes, dark, steady, unbroken, still carried enough fire to guide her daughters through the storm. She had lived through hunger, drought, and the slow theft of the land her people once, music, roamed freely. But none of that compared to this night. Nothing compared to watching her daughters stumble through a world that had already decided they didn't belong. Nayeli followed just behind her, shoulders hunched against the slicing wind. Snow clung to her hair like ash from a dying fire. She stepped carefully, almost too quietly, as if one wrong move might snap the fragile thread of hope keeping them alive. Her breath came in short, shaky bursts, each inhale burning like fire in her chest. She was 22, yet in that storm she looked both worn beyond her years and painfully young. Worn by everything she had survived, and young in how powerless the cold made her feel. Kiona, barely 20, struggled the hardest to stay on her feet. Her legs trembled with every step she forced forward. The cold had sunk so deep into her hands she could no longer feel her fingers. All she carried was a small bundle tied tight with rawhide, the last remnants of a life already lost. Each time the wind shoved her sideways, she reached blindly for Sihara's arm, refusing to fall, refusing to be left behind. They had knocked on doors earlier that day, doors belonging to settlers who pretended they heard nothing, doors that slammed shut before a single word could be finished, doors guarded by rifles and eyes filled with fear and suspicion. No food, no shelter, no mercy. As if being Apache made them less than human. So they kept walking, chased by a storm just as merciless as the people who had turned them away. Hours dragged on. The cold burrowed deeper into their bones, and their music's strength faded like the last dying light of dusk. For a moment, it felt like the storm would finish what hunger and cruelty had started. Then Sihara stopped. Through the blinding white, a thin strand of smoke curled upward, fragile, wavering, but real. It rose from the chimney of a small wooden cabin, music, tucked between 2 low hills. Maybe it was a home, maybe just an abandoned shack. It didn't matter. It was the only sign of life for miles. Kiona followed the direction of her mother's shaking hand. "Smoke," she whispered, her voice nearly swallowed by the wind. Nayeli narrowed her eyes, straining to see through the storm. "Could be anyone," she said, her voice rough and cautious. Could be trouble. Sihara gave a slow nod, but her feet were already moving. Or it could be warmth, she murmured. Music. And warmth is the only thing keeping us alive tonight. They had no idea who waited inside. No idea if they would be welcomed, driven off, or worse. But when death is breathing down your neck, even the faintest flicker of firelight is worth the gamble. Holding on to each other for balance, the three of them forced their way through the final stretch of the storm, moving toward that thin music ribbon of smoke, the last hope they had left. The wind howled behind them, but for the first time that night, something pushed them forward instead of dragging them down. Whatever waited inside that cabin would shape everything that came next, maybe even save them. Outside, the storm slammed against the wooden walls of a small ranch house, rattling it like a giant testing its strength. Music. Inside, the only thing standing against the storm's fury was the steady fire burning low in the hearth, its orange glow spilling across a room built for one man and no more. Eli Boone sat close to it, shoulders bent forward, dragging a metal file along the chipped edge of a plow blade. Each scrape sent sparks jumping, brief, flickering stars that lived and died in the dim light. He wasn't yet 30, but the frontier had already etched its mark deep into his face. There was weight in his eyes, quiet, settled, the kind a man carried when he'd buried more than he'd ever spoken aloud. This land had once belonged to Clara Boone. When she passed, the wide music stretch of dust, fence line, sky, and stubborn earth settled onto Eli's shoulders like a promise he never had the strength to walk away from. Since then, the ranch had been all he had. The barn stood worn, but music unbroken. The cornfields lay stripped down for winter. The fences bore the scars of years of patchwork and repair. And the hearth, always burning, never truly going out, served as the only heartbeat in a house that had grown too used to silence. Eli didn't talk much. Not because he had anything against words, but because there had been no one around to hear them for a long time. Winter's silence had become something familiar, something that asked nothing of him. Sometimes he wondered if the land itself ever felt alone. But the wind never answered, and he stopped asking. The plow blade in his hands had gone dull long ago. He had planned to fix it before the snow came, but work on a ranch never waited. Music and winter came when it pleased. Tools were scattered across the floor, wrenches, rope, bits of iron he'd meant to mend. The place wasn't neat, but it was lived in. Every mark, every worn edge, told a piece of his story. He had just brushed the metal dust from his hands when the wind shifted and carried something strange with it. Sharp, sudden, wrong. Eli froze. It wasn't the house creaking. It wasn't the wind cutting through the boards. It was a knock. Clear's throat. Hard, urgent. Not something that should have been possible in a storm like this. Music. He stood slowly, unsure if he'd imagined it. Then it came again. 3 fast, desperate blows against the door, like someone fighting the storm itself just to stay alive. A chill crept down his spine, and it had nothing to do with the cold. No one traveled in weather like this. No one should have been out there. Music. He grabbed the lantern, lifted the latch, and pulled the door open. The wind slammed into the house, scattering snow across the floor. For a brief moment, there was nothing but white. Then shapes began to take form, blurred figures swaying in the storm's breath. 3 of them, barely standing. Eli stepped forward, raising the lantern higher, his chest tightening. An older woman stood there, wrapped in a thin blanket stiff with ice. Snow clung to her hair. Her lips were pale and cracked, but she held herself upright, steady, unbroken, like the storm hadn't managed to take that from her. Beside her stood 2 younger women, One leaned heavily against the other, her legs buckling with each gust of wind. Their braids, their clothing, the beads and markings resting against the older woman's chest. He knew exactly who they were. Apache. The kind most settlers treated like shadows or threats. Anything but human. Eli didn't step back. He didn't reach for the rifle by the door. He didn't hesitate, because the first thing he saw wasn't who they were. It was the fear in their eyes, the exhaustion, the truth plain as daylight. They were one breath away from collapsing where they stood. Music. Sihara tried to speak, but only a faint rasp slipped through her lips. The storm swallowed whatever words followed. Eli didn't need to hear them. "Get inside," he said, his voice calm and steady, like something solid in the middle of chaos. "Now." He stepped aside just as Kiona's legs finally gave out, catching her before she hit the ground. Snow swirled around them as he lifted her into his arms and carried her inside, while Sihara and Nayeli stumbled in close behind. When Eli Boone pushed the door shut, the storm's howl dulled to a distant roar, but the weight of what had just stepped into his home settled heavy in the fire-lit room. Outside, the wind clawed at the walls like it meant to tear them apart. Inside, 3 fragile lives hung by a thread. And Eli knew it. From that moment on, his life no longer belonged to silence. The door hadn't even fully latched before he was already moving. Instinct took over, faster than thought. Music. Out here, survival didn't leave space for hesitation. Music and kindness, real, unshaken kindness, never waited for reasons. He slid an arm beneath Kiona's shoulders, lowering her carefully onto a rug near the fire, then turned just in time to steady Nayeli before her legs gave out beneath her. Sihara, though trembling from the cold, fought to remain standing, but Eli guided her gently all the same, handling her like something fragile, something worth protecting. Music. He didn't ask who they were, didn't ask where they came from, didn't ask if danger followed close behind. A decent man didn't need answers to recognize 3 souls freezing to death on his music doorstep. The storm raged outside, but inside, Eli moved with calm purpose. He grabbed split logs stacked by the hearth and fed the fire until the flames climbed higher, stretching shadows across the walls. Warmth slowly pushed its way into the frozen air, chasing the cold back inch by inch. "Sit close," he said, his voice steady, like he'd been expecting them all along. "The fire'll take care of the rest." Nayeli reached her hands toward the flames, fingers trembling. Sihara let out a slow breath and sank to her knees before the hearth. Kiona blinked weakly, her pale face flickering in the firelight. Eli turned toward the small kitchen space, pulling down a cast-iron pot and filling it with water from the bucket by the door. He added dried corn, a pinch of salt, and a few herbs he saved for winters like this, the kind of simple meal folks on the frontier depended on when the world turned against them. As the pot warmed, the scent of corn rose with the steam, filling the cabin. Kiona closed her eyes, breathing it in like it alone might keep her alive. Music. Eli glanced their way only to make sure the warmth was reaching them. Nothing more. He didn't stare, didn't pry. Out here, a man learned early that respect could mean the difference between peace and bloodshed. When the soup was ready, he poured it into 3 tin cups and set them carefully beside each of them. "Easy now," he said quietly. "Your body's got to remember what warm food feels like." Sihara looked up at him then. Her eyes held something rare, not fear, not doubt, but a quiet, steady gratitude that didn't need to be spoken. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then she gave a single nod, small but heavy with meaning, like a blessing carried in silence. They ate while the storm outside grew louder, as if it refused to be forgotten. But inside that cabin, warmth music began to sink deep into their bones, settling between strangers. At last, Kiona spoke, her voice thin and fragile, like wind bending through dry reeds. We came from the river valley, before they drove us out. Eli said nothing. He just listened, the way a man listens to rain after a long, empty drought. Nayeli continued, her tone steady but carrying wounds far older than her years. Settlers burned our home, said it wasn't ours anymore, that we didn't belong. She swallowed, her voice tightening. My mother kept us moving, kept us alive. She kept us moving, kept us alive, Nayeli said quietly. Sihara's voice followed, low and unsteady, like something worn thin by too many hard miles. We thought, maybe someone would open a door for us. She paused, her eyes closing as if the memory itself carried weight. But everywhere we went, her voice faded. No one wanted us, Nayeli finished, her words falling heavy into the room. Silence settled in, thick, honest, impossible to ignore. Eli Boone rested his forearms on his knees, eyes fixed on the fire. Out here, the land didn't care who you were, where you came from, or the stories you music carried with you. It only knew hunger, cold, and the endless fight to keep putting one foot in front of the other. And as he music listened, something inside him shifted. It wasn't pity, it wasn't guilt, it was recognition. Pain was pain, loss was loss, and being driven from your home, that was something he understood better than most. You're safe here tonight, he said at last, his voice quiet but steady. Music. That storm won't touch you now. Sihara lowered her head in silent acknowledgement. Nayeli and Kiona edged closer to the fire, their bodies slowly unwinding as warmth began to seep back into their bones. Music. Eli leaned back, letting the firelight brush across his face. Outside, the blizzard still raged, but inside, 4 strangers shared something fragile, something rare. Beneath the old beams of that cabin, something unspoken had begun to take root. By the time the storm finally burned itself out, night had already given way to the soft gray light of morning. The wind, once fierce enough to shake the house to its foundation, now drifted across the plains like a tired spirit settling into rest. Snow lay thick over the fences and rooftops, smoothing every rough edge of the land. It all looked quiet, almost peaceful, like the storm had never shown its teeth at all. Inside, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. A gentle warmth still pulsed from the hearth, just enough to keep the cold at bay without disturbing the stillness that had settled over the room. The 3 women slept close to the fire, their bodies finally relaxed, their faces no longer twisted with fear or pain. Eli stood by the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to let the morning in. Golden light slipped through the wooden frame, settling warm against his skin. The air smelled different after a storm like that. Clean, sharp, carrying the scent of untouched snow and something else. Something like a fresh start. He drew in a slow breath, feeling the weight on his chest ease just a little. For the first time in years, he wasn't waking up to an empty house. Behind him, the faint rustle of blankets broke the silence. Sihara pushed herself upright, wincing as the stiffness from the cold night caught up with her. She watched him for a long moment, music, studying the outline of his back in the morning light. There was something familiar in the way he stood, steady, unshaken, carrying burdens without complaint. When she spoke, her voice was soft, worn smooth by time. "You remind me of my son," she said quietly. "The one I lost." Eli turned, caught off guard by the tenderness in her words. Firelight traced the lines in her face, marks left by years of hardship, now softened by something gentler, music. He opened his mouth, but nothing came at first. The words felt too close, too raw. Then, after a moment, he stepped closer and spoke in a low voice. "And you remind me of my mother." The simplicity of it hit deeper than either of them expected. Two people from different worlds, bound by the same kind of loss carved into them by the land itself. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was something else entirely, the kind shared between souls that recognize something familiar in each other. Sihara's eyes glistened, music not with sorrow, but with quiet acceptance. She lifted her hand and placed it over her heart in a gesture of respect, one Eli didn't fully understand, but one he felt deeply, all the same. By then, the daughters began to wake. Kiona blinked up at the wooden beams overhead, as if she were seeing the world for the very first time. Nayeli pushed herself upright more slowly, rubbing her hands together, trying to coax warmth back into her fingers. The fear that had clung to them the night before had loosened its grip. Music, replaced by something softer, something close to hope, though neither of them dared name it yet. The ranch house, once filled with nothing but creaking boards and restless wind, now carried quiet voices and steady breathing. The presence of others gave the place a different kind of pulse. Even the fire seemed to crackle with more life, as if it, too, welcomed the change. Eli Boone crossed the room, setting the leftover soup back on the stove to warm for the morning. The smell spread slowly through the space, simple, familiar, but comforting in a way that reached deeper than hunger. As Sihara and her daughters rose and moved toward the table, the room filled with soft footsteps, shifting blankets, music, and the faint hum of a tune Kiona didn't even realize she was singing. Life, fragile, quiet, but real, had taken root inside a house that had long forgotten what it meant to feel alive. Eli glanced at them, then at the fire, then out through the frost-lined window. This ranch had always been a place of work, solitude, and memories he kept buried deep. But now, there were voices inside these walls. There were people sharing the warmth of his home. Somewhere beneath the exhaustion, there was laughter waiting, and for the first time in years, he had something to think about beyond just making it through another season. The ranch no longer echoed with emptiness. It had become something else, something warmer, something human, something that felt dangerously close to a family beginning to form. The days that followed carried a gentleness Eli hadn't known in years. The storm had passed, leaving the land washed clean. Snow melted into dark, rich soil, soaking up the early spring sun like it had been waiting for this moment. It felt as though the land itself understood. It had survived something brutal, and now it deserved peace. Life settled into a slower rhythm, a steady one. The kind folks on the frontier trusted, where every sunrise meant another chance to mend what was broken, rebuild what was lost, and breathe a little easier. Eli moved with that rhythm easily, but now he wasn't alone in it. Sihara rose before dawn each morning, long before the sun touched the hills. She moved through the kitchen with quiet purpose, the kind that came from generations of knowledge passed down through hands, not words. Herbs she had gathered and dried long before winter, mint, sage, and others Eli couldn't yet name, found their way into a simmering pot, music. The scent drifted through the cabin and out onto the porch, warm, earthy, wrapping around the home like a blessing spoken in a language older than the land itself. Her cooking was unlike anything Eli had known, simple yet grounding. The flavor deep and steady, like something pulled from the roots of the earth. Kiona spent her mornings outside, wandering along the fence line and down by the creek that cut through the back of the ranch. Music. She returned each time with wildflowers gathered in her hands, Bright yellows, soft purples, small white blossoms that looked like snow that had chosen to stay. She placed them along the windowsills near the fire, beside the lanterns, even tying a few along the porch railing. Eli never said a word about it, but the color changed the place, gave it something wood and fire alone never could. Warmth. Nayeli found her place beside him in the work of the ranch. At first, she observed more than she acted, quiet, watchful, learning the rhythm of every task, every tool, every horse. But it didn't take long before she stepped in without hesitation. She tightened fence rails with steady hands, hauled feed buckets without complaint, and brushed down sable wind with a care that spoke of both strength and understanding. She didn't smile often, but when she did, brief, almost shy, it carried something rare. The kind of warmth that made every long, silent year Eli had endured feel like it had led to something worth holding on to. Music. Together, they worked their way through the endless list of chores the ranch always demanded. Fixing the loose boards on the dust coop flock pen, clearing out broken limbs the storm had scattered across the yard, hauling water up from the well. The work itself hadn't changed, but somehow it felt lighter now, not because it was easier, but because the burden, music, was no longer his to carry alone. And without quite realizing it, Eli Boone began tending to things he had long ignored. The sagging porch step he'd promised himself he'd fix months ago. He replaced it. The loose shutter that never held. He set it right. He carved a new hook where the old one had worn down, even the rocking chair on the porch. Missing a slat for as long as he could remember, he repaired it, music, sanding the wood until it moved smooth and steady once more. He couldn't have said why those things suddenly mattered, why the place should look better, feel warmer, stand a little prouder. But every time he noticed the wildflowers set along the windows, or heard Kiona's soft laughter drifting across the yard, something inside him shifted. Something gentle, something he thought the frontier had taken from him years ago. Evenings came slow and golden, the sun bleeding across the plains until the world glowed like a dying ember. They gathered outside or near the hearth, sharing meals without hurry. The kind of quiet conversation that didn't need filling. But the evenings held something more. Kiona and Nayeli would hum songs he didn't know, Apache melodies that rose and fell like wind threading through pine trees. Sometimes Sihara joined in, her voice low and steady, music carrying a calm that seemed to settle even the restless horses in the corral. Eli didn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling. It was belonging, or maybe just the beginning of it. The ranch no longer echoed with emptiness. There were footsteps in the hallway now, voices weaving through the early light, shadows crossing the yard in groups of 4 instead of 1. For the first time since he'd taken over the land, Eli no longer saw the ranch as something he had to endure, but something worth holding on to, worth caring for, worth sharing. And somewhere deep inside him, a quiet truth took root. The land was healing, and so was he. Spring came in gently, like a traveler unsure of its welcome after a long, brutal winter. The last of the snow melted into thirsty soil, and each new morning, music, carried the scent of damp earth and fresh beginnings. The days stretched longer, and though the work never let up, music it moved with a softer rhythm now, one shaped not just by survival but by shared company. And in those days, between chores, between silence, something else began to grow. Eli first felt it in the barn. He and Nayeli were cleaning out the stalls, pulling away old hay and laying down fresh straw. Dust floated in the warm light, drifting around them like tiny sparks of gold. She worked beside him with quiet focus, steady and sure. She didn't shy away from hard work. If anything, she leaned into it. But every now and then, When their hands reached for the same bundle of hay, they both paused, just for a heartbeat. Fingers brushing. A shared music breath. A silence that carried more weight than words ever could. Neither spoke of it, but both felt it. Something invisible, drawing them closer, little by little. Later they carried water from the well together, the metal handle bit cold against their hands, the weight pulling at their arms. Without thinking, they matched each other's pace, music walking in quiet rhythm. Sunlight slipped through Nayeli's dark hair, and when she turned her head to glance at him, something in Eli tightened. He looked away too quickly, pretending to check on the horses, but he knew she'd seen it. The frontier had a way of hollowing people out, of building walls around the heart so high even the wind couldn't climb them. Nayeli carried those walls too. Her past lived in her eyes, quiet, guarded, shaped by losses she never spoke aloud. The world had taken too much from her, too soon. And trust. Trust was not something she gave easily. But when she stood beside him, something began to change. The tension in her shoulders eased. Her steps grew lighter, and sometimes, just sometimes, her expression softened enough to reveal the woman she might have been, before the world taught her to always be ready for it to turn against her. They spent one afternoon gathering dry leaves in the yard, raking them into small piles for compost. The breeze drifted past, carrying the scent of pine and sun-warmed earth. When they both straightened at the same time, their hands met again, this time lingering just a moment longer. Neither pulled away right away. Nayeli's breath caught, subtle, but enough for Eli Boone to notice. His heart answered in its own awkward rhythm, music, but neither of them spoke of it. Not yet. The days unfolded like that. Quiet glances, unplanned touches, something growing between them with the slow, stubborn strength music of a seed forcing its way through hard soil. Then came an evening that shifted everything. The sun dipped low behind the hills, staining the sky a deep amber. The ranch settled into its usual calm, the animals quiet, music long shadows stretching across the yard. Eli stood beneath the porch roof, wiping his hands with a worn rag after finishing the day's work. The door creaked open behind him. Nayeli stepped out, the last light of day catching her face. She paused before moving closer, her steps careful, uncertain, as though she wasn't sure if crossing that distance was a mistake. When she reached the porch, she kept her gaze fixed on the horizon instead of him. Her voice, when it came, was soft, softer than he had ever heard it. "You don't have to do all this for us," she said. "Not the food, not the work, not the protection. You don't owe us anything." Eli studied her quietly. The way the fading light traced her features, the vulnerability she tried to hide in the stillness of her posture. Something inside him shifted, steady, certain, unafraid. "I know I don't have to," he said. "I choose to." That made her look at him, truly look. Her eyes searched his face, hunting for something, a crack, a hidden intention, the kind of cruelty life had taught her to expect. But there was nothing there. Eli swallowed, his voice low, grounded like a promise. "This is my home," he said. "And I want it to be safe for the people under it." The words lingered music between them, heavy with meaning neither dared speak aloud. The evening breeze brushed past, cool and gentle, and for a brief moment, the world felt still enough for truth to exist. Nayeli's voice trembled, not from fear, but from something new. "Thank you," she whispered. It was barely more than breath, but to Eli it felt like the first stone had been pulled from a wall she'd spent her entire life building. And as night slowly settled over the plains, something brighter than daylight stirred quietly beneath the old music wooden roof. something that felt dangerously close to love. But trouble, out here, arrived the same way storms did. Quiet at first, then fast. Music, then all at once. That morning, there had been no warning. The sky stood clear. The land lay still. The ranch seemed to breathe easy after days filled with work and quiet laughter. But peace on the frontier was fragile, and it didn't take much to break it. Eli felt it before he saw it. Sable Wind, in the corral, lifted her head sharply, ears pinned forward. The dust coop flock froze mid-scratch. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then it came, the distant thunder of hooves striking hard ground. Not one rider, several, riding fast. Eli stepped out onto the porch, rag still in hand, music, and looked toward the ridge just in time to see 4 men on horseback coming down toward his home. Dust kicked up behind them, curling through the air around their boots and gun belts. Their faces were hard, tight jaws, cold eyes, no trace of welcome. These weren't neighbors riding in for talk. These were men looking for trouble, and riding in certain they'd find it. Inside the house, Sihara and her daughters went still. Nayeli's hand moved without thought, settling on Kiona's shoulder, easing her back behind her. Like she already knew the kind of men coming up that slope. Fear flashed in their eyes, but not the shaking kind. The kind born from too many doors slammed shut, too many flames in the night, music, too many times forced to run from places they once called home. Eli Boone stepped off the porch and planted himself firm in the yard, music feet set, hands empty. He didn't reach for the rifle resting by the door. Music. He wanted them to see it clear. He wasn't afraid, and he wasn't about to give ground. The riders pulled their horses to a stop just a few yards from him. The man at the front, broad-shouldered, thick beard, eyes mean as barbed wire, looked music past Eli toward the house. The moment he saw the women standing in the doorway, something ugly twisted across his face. "So it's true," Garrick Briggs spat. "You took in Apache." Eli said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than anything else. One of Briggs' riders leaned forward in his saddle. "You know they don't belong out here," he said. "Folks don't want 'em near their land. They bring nothing but trouble." Behind Eli, Sihara flinched like she'd been struck. Nayeli's jaw tightened. Kiona shrank back into the shadows. Eli's voice came out low and even. "They're under my roof." Briggs let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Then we're telling you to throw them out, same as everyone else did." He leaned forward slightly, his tone turning cold. "Unless you want their trouble becoming yours." Heat stirred beneath Eli's ribs, but he kept it locked down. Out here, anger didn't win anything. Resolve did. He stepped forward, not aggressive, but unshakable. "This is my land," he said, "my home, and under my roof, people are treated with respect." The riders glanced at one another, caught off guard for a split second. Then came the smirks, the threats, the kind of talk meant to push a man into choosing fear over what's right. "They'll ruin this place," one of them muttered. "You'll regret standing with them," another added. Briggs' voice cut through them all. "Get rid of them, now." Eli didn't move, didn't blink, didn't bend. "No." The word landed heavy, still, final. A silence followed, thick as iron. Then Eli added, his voice calm, but sharp enough to cut clean through bone. "On my land, everyone's safe." He tipped his head slightly toward the open plains behind them. "You don't like it. You know the way out." Garrick Briggs' face darkened, his grip tightening on the reins until his knuckles turned white. For a moment, it looked like he might reach for his gun. But something in Eli's stance, the way he stood there, steady, unflinching, sent a ripple of hesitation through them. Briggs gave a harsh snort, jerking his horse around. "You'll regret this," he muttered. One by one, Briggs' riders turned with him, throwing bitter looks toward the women before riding off, hooves pounding against the earth, dust trailing behind them like a storm. Eli stood there, watching until they disappeared over the ridge. He already knew. This wasn't over. Men like that didn't let things go. They carried grudges, and sooner or later, they came back. When he turned toward the porch, Nayeli let out a breath she'd been holding too long. Kiona still clung close to her and Sihara, her eyes bright with tears she didn't bother hiding. Music. Nayeli stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached for his. "You gave us more than shelter today," she said, her voice breaking. "You gave us dignity." Eli didn't know what to say, so he didn't. He just closed his hand around hers, steady, sure. And even with trouble still hanging out there beyond the horizon, under that roof, something had been forged. Something stronger than fear. Something stronger than fear, stronger than hate, strong enough to reshape the course of every life beneath that roof. Night settled over the plains slowly, like a blanket pulled gently over a sleeping child. The air carried the scent of cooling earth and distant pine, the kind of stillness only the frontier could hold. So quiet a man could hear his own heartbeat if he stood still long enough. After the tension with Garrick Brigg and his riders earlier that day, the ranch had gone quiet. Not peaceful, just still, like the land itself was waiting. Eli Boone stepped outside once the last of the chores were done, letting the cool night air wash the dust and unease from his skin. Above him stretched an endless sky, dark and wide, scattered with stars that burned sharp and steady. Out here, beneath a sky like that, a man could feel small, but not alone. Not tonight. He didn't hear her come out. Not until the soft crunch of footsteps reached him across the frost-hardened ground. Nayeli. She moved toward him quietly, her posture cautious, but her steps certain, like she had already made up her mind long before stepping outside. She came to stand beside him on the porch, leaving only a breath between them. Firelight from inside spilled across her face, painting her features in a soft amber glow. Her dark hair caught the warmth, shifting gently in the night breeze. Music. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of things they both felt, but didn't yet know how to say. Eli glanced at her. She kept her eyes on the stars. There was something different in her expression. Not fear, not guardedness. Something softer. Something like surrender. She spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "I used to watch the sky when I was younger." She paused, searching for the words. "On nights like this, I thought maybe the Creator was sending signs." Her voice faltered slightly. "But lately..." "Music," she exhaled. "I've been watching the ground more. It's easier that way. Easier not to hope for anything." Music. Eli listened, something tightening in his chest. The world had been too cruel to her, far more than it had any right to be. And still, she stood there, looking up again, like she was remembering how. "You deserved hope," he said quietly. That made her turn. Their eyes met in the lantern light hanging from the porch beam. And for a moment, everything else faded. The warmth of the house behind them, the open sky above, the safety of the land beneath their feet. It all narrowed down to that one moment, that one shared silence. When her hand brushed his, it wasn't by accident. Not this time. Her fingers touched his knuckles, light, careful, deliberate. Music. Eli's breath caught. It was a small thing, simple, but to them, it carried the weight of something unspoken. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. Instead, their fingers slowly intertwined. Tentative, but sure. As if both of them feared moving too fast might break whatever fragile thing was forming between them. Music. No words were needed. Eli felt it as clearly as he felt the wind on his skin. She trusted him. And little by little, she was letting him into the part of herself she had kept closed to the world. Music. A soft sound came from the doorway. Sihara stood there, watching. A gentle smile rested on her face. Quiet, knowing. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her eyes said everything. She had seen love before, watched it endure storms harsher than this one, and now she saw it again. In the way Nayeli leaned just a little closer, music, and in the way Eli's hand tightened around hers, steady and protective. Sihara's smile deepened, touched by gratitude, by relief, and maybe by the answer to a prayer she had carried into the night sky more times than she could count. Nayeli noticed Sihara standing in the doorway, but she didn't pull her hand away. If anything, her fingers tightened slightly around Eli Boone's. Eli lifted his gaze toward Sihara and gave a small, respectful nod, an unspoken promise that what he felt was real, even if he hadn't yet found the words for it. The lantern swayed gently, its light flickering as shadows moved slow and steady around them. The prairie wind drifted past, carrying the distant cry of the red howlers. And yet the ranch, the porch, the wide open sky, it all felt warm, alive, hopeful. Two hearts, worn down by a life that had never been kind. Music had found something soft in the stillness of that night. And somewhere out in the darkness, the land itself seemed to breathe out, welcoming the beginning of a love it had long been waiting to shelter. Spring didn't arrive with noise or spectacle. It came quietly, almost carefully, like it needed permission to return after the harshness of winter. The last snow melted from the hills, revealing soil dark as coffee grounds, rich, ready, waiting. Birds came back in pairs. The wind softened. The days warmed enough that Eli rolled his sleeves without thinking. One morning, he made his way up the hill toward the old tree, the one that had stood there longer than he had. The place where Clara Boone rested beneath the earth. He came there often, always in silence. Music. It was the last piece of a life he had once known. As he reached the tree, something caught his eye. A single wildflower, pale yellow, fragile, pushing its way through the damp soil at the base of the trunk. Music. The first bloom of the season, the first sign that life could rise again, even in a place shaped by loss. Eli knelt beside it, brushing his fingers lightly across the petals. It felt like a message, though he couldn't quite understand it. Gentle, music, unexpected, almost sacred. Behind him, he heard soft footsteps. Nayeli came to stand beside him, saying nothing. Her eyes moved from the flower to the rough bark of the tree, then to the quiet weight in his expression. She didn't ask who lay beneath that ground. She already knew. The land had a way of telling its stories without words. Slowly, with quiet reverence, she reached out and rested her hand against the tree. As if greeting Clara Boone, as if asking for her blessing, as if honoring something deeper than words could ever carry. Eli watched her, feeling something warm unfold inside his chest, something as fragile and as rare as the flower blooming at his knees. Music. Back at the ranch, life moved forward with the rhythm of spring. Kiona wandered near the creek, gathering herbs with careful hands. Sihara stirred a pot over the fire, humming softly, her voice drifting across the hills as the wind carried the scent of sage, pine, and something new, Before long, the four of them worked the land side by side, as if they had always belonged together. They knelt in the soil, planting rows of corn. They laughed when the dust coop flock stole seeds from their hands. They pulled weeds, repaired music fence posts, and fixed tools without a word needing to be said. The ranch, once quiet, once hollow, now moved with purpose, with life. Eli looked at them, these three women who had walked into his world through a storm, and felt the truth settle deep within him, steady as a heartbeat. This wasn't just his home anymore. It was theirs. A family not tied by blood, but built through choice, kindness, and the will to survive. But even as hope took root in the soil, something beyond the ranch was shifting. Sihara felt it first. Whispers carried on the wind, drifting in from the distant road. The kind of whispers that made Sihara's eyes turn hard with memories she had never truly left behind. Later that afternoon, a rider pulled up near the ranch gate. Dust-covered, uneasy. Elric Vane. He asked for water, but his eyes kept shifting, like a man carrying news he didn't want to be the one to deliver. When Eli Boone stepped closer, Elric leaned in and lowered his voice. "Word in town is, those men you turned away ain't letting this die," he muttered. He wiped sweat from his brow. Music. They're gathering folks, holding meetings, stirring something up. Eli's jaw tightened. He gave a short nod of thanks. Music. But the word stayed with him long after Elric rode off. He didn't bring it up to the women. Not yet. Not because he meant to hide it, but because he needed time to think. Time to figure out how to keep them safe. Nayeli felt the shift in him right away. Music. She didn't question it, but Sihara saw it too. She had lived long enough to recognize that look. The quiet wait in a man bracing for a storm he prayed wouldn't come. That evening, as the sky burned in shades of pink and gold, the wind changed. It carried something heavier now, something that didn't belong to spring. Music. Eli stood on the porch, eyes fixed on the far road. The hills felt too still, the horizon too quiet. He knew better than to trust peace out here. Behind him, Sihara stepped close and rested her hand gently on his arm. "We have faced worse," she said softly. Music. But this time, we face it together. Eli nodded, but the weight in his chest only grew tighter, because deep down, he already knew. The next storm wasn't coming with snow. It was coming with men. The wind shifted again just past midday the next day, barely noticeable at first, then strong enough to rattle the lantern hanging from the porch beam. It blew warm, music thick with dust and something distant. Hooves. Not like the cold northern winds of winter. This one came from the south, heavy, tense, carrying a warning older than the land itself. Eli stepped out onto the porch, his boots striking against the worn wood. His gaze moved slowly across the land, past the rows they had planted together, past the fence line he and Nayeli had fixed just days before, all the way to the ridge where the earth met the sky. He didn't see anything yet, but he felt it, like pressure building before a storm breaks. It wasn't fear, it was certainty, the kind that settled deep in a man's bones long before trouble showed its face. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. Sihara stepped out first, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, her eyes sharp, already knowing. Kiona followed close beside her, music, quiet, but steady. And then Nayeli. She moved last, but with the strongest presence of them all. Calm, grounded, ready. None of them asked what he was looking at. They didn't need to. They felt it too. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, they didn't reach for their things. They didn't prepare to run. They didn't shrink from what was coming. They stood behind him. 3 women who had spent years being chased, now standing their ground. Sihara drew in a slow breath. "This land remembers everything," Sihara murmured. "The kindness, the cruelty, the promises, the storms." Eli Boone gave a slow nod. "And it remembers who belongs here." Nayeli stepped up beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. The contact was slight, but the meaning behind it settled deep and steady in his chest. She looked out toward the horizon, then turned her gaze to him, her voice quiet, but unshaken. "We're not running," she said. "Not anymore." Those words struck him harder than any threat Garrick Brigg could ever throw his way. Not fear, choice. They weren't staying because they had nowhere else to go. They were staying because this place had become worth fighting for. Music. Eli placed his hand over hers on the porch railing. No grand promises, no spoken vows, just a quiet, unbreakable understanding. Music. The wind rose again, sweeping dust across the yard. The dust coop flock huddled tight near their pen. Sable wind shifted in the corral, restless. The land itself felt uneasy, like it knew what was coming. Kiona stepped closer to Nayeli, whispering something in their native tongue. Music, soft, calming, like a prayer carried on breath. Sihara's eyes held the same message, even if her face gave nothing away. They had faced storms before. This time, they would not face it alone. Music. Then it came, faint at first, but building, the sound they all knew too well. Hoofbeats. Distant, steady, echoing like a heartbeat rolling in from the hills. They appeared along the ridge, right where the sky seemed to fold into the earth. One rider, then 2, then more. Shadows on horseback gathering together like a dark storm cloud closing in. Eli stepped off the porch, boots planting firm into the soil of his land. His voice came low, steady, shaped by loss and something stronger than it. "If they're coming for trouble," he said, eyes locked on the ridge, "they'll find I'm not standing alone this time." Nayeli moved beside him, shoulder to shoulder, her chin lifted. Behind them, Sihara and Kiona stood firm, the sinking sun casting long, unbroken shadows across the yard. The hoofbeats grew louder. The air thickened. The ridge darkened with approaching figures. Eli drew in one slow breath, then let it go, and spoke the words that would open a chapter none of them could yet see. A chapter that would test everything they had built. Love, faith, music, and the fragile peace they had fought to hold on to. "If it's a storm they want," he squared his shoulders, "then a storm's what they'll get." The riders crested the ridge. The light dimmed, and for a single breath, the whole world stood still.